Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, in this video we will talk about the alleged presence of Cuban and Russian mercenaries as reinforcements to the police and repressive forces of dictator Nicolas Maduro. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news. The aberrant electoral fraud carried out by dictator Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela was a long and very well-planned process that began to be implemented many months ago. It began with the arrest, impeachment, and removal of the regime's main political opponents, especially Maria Corina Machado, who was made ineligible for 15 years by the courts controlled by Maduro. In addition to persecuting its opponents, the Chavista regime applied censorship, persecuting journalists, websites, magazines, newspapers and radio stations, in addition to blocking access to dozens of blogs and independent news sites throughout the country. But even with all these actions, Nicolas Maduro was defeated in the presidential elections on July 28, with the opposition presenting more than 80% of the votes, giving Edmundo Gonzalez 67% of the votes, with Maduro receiving only 30%. Even so, and without presenting any evidence, the CNE, the National Electoral Council, completely controlled by Maduro, certified the Venezuelan dictator and recognized him as the winner of the elections, despite, I repeat, not having presented any evidence. In other words, the dictator Maduro, who actually counts the votes in Venezuela, simply said that he won the elections, and went on to accuse the opposition of fascism and a coup d'état. What happened in Venezuela, before, during and immediately after the elections, is like the application, in practice, of a manual with a step-by-step guide on how to rig elections. And now, a few days after the elections, with the Venezuelan dictator still refusing to present evidence that he won, the country is in the process of repressing the opposition, a phase that necessarily involves force and police violence. As I have said in other videos here on the channel, Maduro completely controls the police and military forces in Venezuela, thanks to mass promotions that have made the country the one with the largest number of high-ranking officers on the entire planet. And it was precisely to demonstrate their unconditional support that the commanders, led by the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, released a video accusing the opposition of being part of an alleged international fascist movement of the far right, with the mission of promoting a coup d'état to overthrow Nicolas Maduro from power. It is always important to remember that he holds this power illegally, refusing to provide evidence that he actually received the votes he said he did. In addition to controlling the armed forces and police, Maduro also completely controls Venezuelan institutions, especially the courts, which since 1999, when Hugo Chavez came to power in the country, have been equipped and occupied entirely by jurists aligned with the Chavista regime. And so, with complete control of the security forces and the courts, Maduro is now moving on to the next phase, which is the brutal and violent repression of the opposition, aiming to crush any voice that dares to speak out against the dictatorship. In this sense, the regime's chosen narrative is the coup d'état, which, as I mentioned earlier, is being raised by the Venezuelan military to justify violent actions against protesters. Using the justification of fighting a coup d'état financed by foreign powers, the Venezuelan security forces are violently preventing any and all demonstrations, with the courts arresting and threatening anyone caught in these protests with sentences of up to 30 years in prison, with sources reporting that more than 1,000 people have already been detained since July 28. However, if the opposition's huge advantage in the elections is confirmed, Maduro will have to face a mass of indignant people made up of almost 70% of the population. To face so many opponents, Venezuelan forces alone may not be enough. And that is why, according to several photos and videos, mercenaries from countries such as Cuba and Russia are operating in the country. The Cuban regime is heavily sanctioned by the United States, limiting many of the island's commercial and economic options. This means that, legally speaking, Cuba is only able to negotiate with other nations that are also sanctioned. With Venezuela only 1,000 kilometers away, it is the closest and most accessible sanctioned country. That is why it is in Cuba's best interest that Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship does not fall. There are, of course, no precise figures on alleged Cuban military personnel in Venezuela. But, as I said, videos and testimonies from locals confirm that Cuban units are, in fact, operating in the country. In the case of the Russians, the first evidence of the presence of mercenaries emerged after the 2017 protests, with the first clearest evidence emerging in early 2019, with Reuters citing 3 separate sources, stating that an undetermined number of mercenaries from the Wagner Group were operating in the country. According to the sources cited by Reuters, the Russian mercenaries were given the mission of protecting Nicolas Maduro and senior members of his regime, a mission that, according to other sources, expanded over time, also including training Venezuelan units and even reinforcing the ranks for special missions, such as kidnapping and neutralizing opponents. At that time, the Wagner Group was still led by its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, but after his elimination in August 2023, the group came under the direct control of the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin using these mercenaries to expand Russia's presence and influence in areas such as the African Sahel, and of course, also in Venezuela. The Russians, like the Cubans, have a vested interest in keeping Maduro in power. However, in Russia's case, the interest is not so much commercial as strategic, given the rivalry between Maduro and the United States. Russia knows that if Nicolas Maduro falls, a politician more aligned with the United States will most likely come to power. Therefore, as long as Maduro is in control of the country, instability will reign in the region, forcing the United States to keep a close eye on the Caribbean region, especially now that Nicolas Maduro is taking all measures to invade Guyana, aiming to annex the Essequibo, an area rich in oil and other mineral resources. Maduro's animosity towards the United States and the threat of a war of invasion and conquest in South America are important elements for Vladimir Putin, as they force the Pentagon to keep resources in that region that could otherwise be sent to areas of Russian interest, such as Ukraine and the Black Sea. Therefore, the various videos and local testimonies confirm that, in fact, Cuban and Russian military personnel are operating in Venezuela, with the Cubans probably being used more to reinforce and bolster Venezuelan lines, increasing the number of agents and fighters, and with the Russians more dedicated to protecting Maduro, top members of his regime, important strategic facilities such as ports, airports and refineries, and also to training local forces and even carrying out special operations. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news.